Rhetoric Quest.
Today we're going to talk about communication climates and what we can do to improve a communication climate. So there's things that we can know about the communication climate that we're in that can let us know whether it is a better or worse communication climate. The worse a communication climate is, the more certain people are in their statements. The better a communication climate is, the more provisional people are in their statements. The worse the communication climate is, the more controlling people are about looking at other people's actions. The more positive a communication climate is, the more people are problem-oriented. The worse a communication climate is, the more competitive people are. The better a communication climate is, the more cooperative people are. The worse a communication climate there is, the more critical people are. The better a communication climate is, the more descriptive people are. The worse a communication climate is, the more indifferent people are. The better a communication climate is, the more empathetic people are. The more difficult and the more toxic a communication climate is, the more manipulative people are. In less toxic, better communication climates, people are assertive rather than manipulative. In a poor communication climate, people are just rude to each other. In a good communication climate, people are civil to each other. And the truth is, none of this usually happens of a communication climate being all good or all bad. Most communication climates exist somewhere in the middle. Sometimes they are way to the good side on one thing, way to the bad side on the other. But a lot of times on all of these, you kind of, there's more certainty than maybe there should be, but people tend to be provisional, right? And I didn't get these ideas about what makes a good or bad communication climate just out of thin air. I've looked at a number of different lists and research sources that have shown different ways of measuring climate. I've looked at Adler, Proctor and Manning, Dan Rothwell's book in Mixed Company. Both of these have slightly different lists, but if you kind of combine them, you can get a really good picture like this one here of what makes a good communication climate and what makes a poor communication climate. So when I think about communication climates and how they occur, I think it's important that we understand that we're not talking about one-time things. So you cussed out your kids today. Well, that was a bad thing to do. You shouldn't have done that. But you know what? It doesn't mean that now you've got a negative communication climate in your home. So you and your coworkers worked really hard on this project together. You got it done. You feel really good about it. But that doesn't necessarily mean you've got a positive communication climate at work, right? It's just these can be one-time occurrences. When a communication climates occur, it's because there's either an escalation, which is almost always bad, or a de-escalation, which is almost always good. Now, this is common language that we find throughout the literature on interpersonal communication, where they'll talk about escalation and de-escalation. I like it, but I like better William R. Brown's concept of deviance amplifying or deviance compensating cycles. And maybe you don't like those as well, because those are kind of like hefty words. But here's the idea. In a deviance amplifying cycle, some kind of deviance happens. This is a bad thing that we don't want to happen. And when that deviance happens, it results in more of that deviance happening, right? So these are communication climates that just build on each other, making themselves continue to be bad. Deviance compensating cycles are cycles in which there is a deviance that occurs. Something bad happens in the communication situation. But the climate is such that it's built into the system that there are ways to compensate when those things go bad. So your boss came in and yelled at you today. Well, that was inappropriate, wasn't it? And now, is that going to mean that now you are going to build on that and you're just going to start critiquing your boss, right? Or does that mean we have a thing built into this where now I can help my boss not do that next time, right? Is this built into it? Is this a way we can do it? And so I like that concept of deviance amplifying and deviance compensating cycles. And I like to think about this in ways in which each of those areas we can build in compensations rather than amplifications of the bad that are going on, because that gives us the opportunity to be a change agent, is what William R. Brown calls it, a change agent to actually work in the communication of our climates and make them better. So I want to talk today, taking each of those areas from before and talk about how we can build a communication climate that is compensatory towards deviation rather than a communication climate that is amplifying of deviation. The first on that list was certainty versus provisionalism. So in negative communication climates, the more negative a communication climate is, the more people communicate with certainty. This is definitely what I said. You weren't listening. Those kinds of things where somebody just says, okay, I am certain that my experience is the experience of that is objective and real, and we don't really need to listen to anybody else's experience. Provisional experience communication is communication that recognizes that our experience with reality is probably pretty unique to other people's experience of reality, and that it's not necessarily going to be the same. So what do we need to create a deviance compensating cycle where we don't respond to certainty with certainty, but we instead respond to certainty with provisionalism? I find a really good answer to this in Alfred Korzybski's concept of Apple 1 is not Apple 2. Indexing, he calls it. So this is the idea that you ate an apple and now you have an idea of apples. But somebody else eating an apple might have a very different experience of eating that apple and a different conception of apples. And it might be that the apples are actually different. So we're not comparing apples and oranges, we're comparing apples and still recognizing that there's going to be a difference between my experience of an apple and your experience of an apple. Indexing also includes dating, right? So that the experience that I had as a college student in the late 1990s might be really different than the experience of a college student in the mid 2020s, right? That this is different. There's might be some things the same, but I shouldn't just say this is how college is, because my college experience is different. And so this is a way of being provisional, to say that, okay, I'm not going to deny your experience. What I'm going to do is say this was my experience and it's useful to the extent that it's useful. A toxic communication climate is one that's more controlling, whereas a positive communication climate is more problem oriented. And the difference between these two is one of them focuses on the person, the other one focuses on the problem. So how do we work with this? Well, one of the ways that has really helped me is to keep in mind the idea of fix the problem, not the blame. Sometimes when we encounter difficulties in life, our first inclination is to find out whose fault it is. And that's not useful. I always think of who left the refrigerator door open. Well, clearly everybody, it's open. And that's not really what you're saying. What you're saying is we need to make sure that the refrigerator door gets closed. But if you start blaming the person, you start to create this defensive communication climate where people are trying to say, no, I'm not to blame, she's to blame, I'm not to blame, he's to blame. And it doesn't really ever get to solve the problem. Anytime you are tempted to solve a problem by blaming a person, you're probably building into a climate that could potentially become very toxic. So instead, we don't focus on the person. What we do is we focus on, this is something that happened. What can we do to make sure it doesn't happen again? How can we make sure that this doesn't happen again? And that's not about the person. That's about the problem, right? Or how can we even solve the problem? Not even how can we make sure it doesn't happen again, but how can we solve it, right? This problem exists now. It doesn't matter whose fault it is. It doesn't matter if it's the fault of the baby boomers or the millennials. The problem is here now, and we need to deal with it, right? Fix the problem, not the blame. Don't worry about whose fault something is. Negative communication climates tend to be more competitive. Positive communication climates tend to be more cooperative. Cooperation always works better than competition for doing whatever it is that you want to do. Sometimes we get this idea that competition is better because it, always gets you the best person doing something. And that's not even necessarily the place. In fact, cooperation works so much better that we've even made it illegal in a number of places. We recently looked at Google in our court system in the United States, and we found that Google was being just too cooperative with a number of other agents in the technology world, and that had resulted in a control of the market that was just way too powerful, and they needed to change and become competitive instead, because that wouldn't work as well, right? And there's a lot of things where we say, oh, it's not going to work as well if we are competitive, and that's always going to be the case, right? So you might say, well, what about on sports? Well, here's the thing: if the goal is to make baskets, just to let both teams make as many baskets as possible will get you the most baskets, way more than if you're competing against each other and stopping them from getting baskets, and they're stopping you from getting baskets, right? So we put in the competition so that things don't go as well. And we forget that sometimes and start to think that the competition in and of itself is good. No, it's just like everything else. I use the example of baskets. So in basketball, you have to dribble. Why is that? Well, it's to make moving up and down the court harder, right? And that's the whole point of sports, is to make a relatively simple thing more difficult, right? That's the whole thing. But in our real lives, we want to make our simple things as simple as we can. And the best way to do that is if, instead of trying to find a way to make things, make one person win, we find a way to cooperate. Moving into a cooperative climate, trying to make things more cooperative, I think is really, to a huge amount, about just adjusting your mind, right? So this is a phrase that I have found just really has been useful for me for understanding when I should not be competitive. And that is, a rising tide raises all ships. There's a temptation when I find out that President Shepard got this big bonus. He's the president of my university. And I'm here barely surviving on what I make, and just his bonus is like 3 years' salary for me. And I'm like, well, that's not fair. But here's the thing: if we have a better president at the university, it will be a better university for me, and I will have a better situation overall. I can get upset about his bonus, or I can say, you know what, we have a better university because we're paying our president better, and tying his bonuses to how much better of a president he is. And so it is ultimately better for me to see him succeed than if I succeed myself. That is cooperation, and kind of getting that idea into your head is just going to make things so much better for you, because you'll realize that making other people successful is the best way for you to be successful. And that is a powerful moment when your communication climate can kind of make that tipping point to where it's no longer competitive and now it's cooperative. I've seen that. I'm chair of the humanities department here at WNMU. And I saw a chair under which things got competitive, where people were going to insist on their way. And it was rather uncomfortable. But I saw that change under the previous chair to me. I do not take a bit of credit for this. But under her leadership, we kind of got this realization that we can succeed best by helping the others succeed. And boy, this has been an amazing change. And it's an amazing change in climate, and it can be an amazing change in climate for you. Negative communication climates are critical rather than descriptive. Right? You try and find what's wrong rather than describing what is. Back in the 70s, and I think it went into the 80s a little bit, there was this TV show called Dragnet. And in this TV show, the policeman would be taking interviews with witnesses to crimes, usually crimes. And he would be taking notes on a little tiny notebook while he did that. And the person would give this information about the crime that also included their interpretation, right? And so he would always say, just the facts. Usually, just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts, sir. And this idea of just the facts gets to the core of being descriptive rather than critical, right? If you say, for instance, you didn't wash the dishes, you said you were going to wash the dishes and it's not done, right? This kind of looking at things from an accusatory fashion, or you say, here's some facts. You and I agreed before I cooked that if I cooked, you would wash the dishes. I have cooked, and I don't see the dishes as having been washed, right? Now, this is a little different than making the accusation. Now, in the end, you're still asking the person to wash the dishes, which is what you're supposed to do. But instead of making it an accusation of you didn't do this, you state the facts. It's not done, and it needs to be done. Not making into an accusation allows the opportunity for explanation. Well, I haven't done it yet because I'm letting the pot soak, or I haven't done it yet. You give your reasons, right? Rather than an accusation where that doesn't leave any rooms for it, right? And so what you want to do is you want to give the facts in a situation, not what you think about the facts. Negative communication environments tend to be more indifferent, and positive communication environments tend to be more empathetic. The more positive a communication environment is, the more the participants in that communication environment are to be concerned about each other's feelings more than their own. There's a statement, and if you look online, you're going to find a lot of people take credit for coming up with this statement. And maybe one of them is right, but it's a lot of times I look on there and I see people come and say, I came up with this idea, and that it was, I remember people saying that before that person was really born. So it's probably not true, but this phrase comes through, and it's chiasmus. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. This idea of people don't care how much you know. It doesn't matter whether or not you know the best way to load and unload the dishwasher. That really doesn't matter if the person who you're asking to load and unload the dishwasher doesn't think you care about them, right? And so that's what empathy does. Now, I think most of you are probably not total jerks who will say, well, I don't give a care, right? When somebody starts telling you about how they feel. Instead, they'll be it's like, fake it that they kind of do care. That's not going to work because people can tell, right? Instead, when you're talking to somebody and they're explaining to you how they feel in a situation, you care about how they feel, and you don't just care about the situation. And making sure that you do that, you put the person first, you care about the person first, and solving the problem second. That's when things start to go well for you. In negative communication environments, people tend to be more manipulative. Whereas in positive communication environments, people tend to be more assertive. In negative communication environments, people tend to be more manipulative. So I want to make sure that I'm really clear on something here, because I've seen people getting confused and thinking that aggressiveness is assertiveness. And that is not the case. Aggressiveness is not assertiveness. Aggressiveness is manipulative. If a person changes their behavior because they are afraid of your negative reaction, that's manipulation. If they're afraid you're going to start yelling at them, if they're afraid you're going to do something to them, that's manipulation. Assertiveness is where you go in calm. Sometimes you have to wait in order to say this stuff for a time when you can do it calmly. What you do is you describe the concrete behavior that happened. You don't say, and that was because you're a jerk, or that was, you failed me in this way. No, you describe the concrete behavior that happened. You give your interpretation of that failure. And when this happened, I, taking responsibility for your feelings, felt this. Not you made me feel this, I felt this, right? I felt like it was like this. So you interpret, you give your feelings, and then you say, and so that's not going to work for me. If this happens again, this is the situation. This is what I'm going to do in response. And it has to be something you really do in response, right? This is going to be my response. It's not an aggressive response. Now, if you do this again, I am going to talk to HR. If you do this again, I'm gonna have to tell the pastor. I don't know. If you do this again, this is going to be what happens. It has to be something you'd really do. And then explain your intention to follow through on that. Here are the things that I'm putting in place to make it easier for me to make sure that consequence is real. And this is what I want out of this situation. This is the change that I really want to see. This is my intention here. And the intention should not be to, hurt the other person back. The intention should be to find a good way to do things. Now, none of that is aggressive. If it's just that a person is adjusting to you because they're afraid you're going to be mad, that's manipulation, right? If somebody adjusts to you because if you don't, you're going to beat them up, that's manipulation. If somebody adjusts to you because if they don't, they're going to take away your phone, that's manipulation. It's not an explanation. It's not the assertiveness. Negative communication environments are often environments where people are rude to each other. Whereas positive communication environments are situations in which people are civil to each other. So sometimes we get comfortable with people, right? Especially this can happen in families where you start to get comfortable with somebody, and so you treat them worse than you would ever treat a stranger. You start saying things that those are really rude things to say. And that creates a negative environment. In a positive communication environment, the communication is always civil. Now, that word civil that I used before, It comes from a Latin word meaning having to do with cities. Sometimes we'll also call civility urbane, meaning something that is urban. And for some of us who are from really like rural backgrounds, we look at that and we think, no, city people are rude. It's country people who are civil to each other. And that's kind of beside the point. The idea really comes from a translation from Aristotle, and his term was the polis, right, the city in which people are polite, and when you are polite, you can do things politically, right? And so when you are polite, you are doing things in a political way. And sometimes this leads to something we call political correctness. And you hear a lot of negativity, or at least you used to, about political correctness. I think the negativity has moved on to another word, woke, that people start to talk about. But being politically correct is just trying not to hurt people's feelings, right? Don't call people names that they don't like to be called. Don't refer to people in ways that are going to group them in an uncomfortable way with other people. Don't use words that other people that people are going to be hurt by. Right now, people are going to be hurt by words no matter what. But using words to hurt people, or this word hurts people, but you go ahead and you decide you're going to do it anyway. That's not being polite. That's not being civil. That's being rude. Right? So politically correct, political, polite, urbane, civil, right? This decision that I am not going to do things in a way that I think is likely to hurt other people. And if I do something that hurts other people, I'm going to take responsibility for that, say I did it, and then try not to do that same thing in the future. That's what it means to be polite. And you can do that. If you are in a negative communication environment, to just be polite to the other person is really a good situation, a good example of how you can start to turn that deviance amplifying cycle into a deviance compensating cycle. It can be a really good first step. Sometimes it can get really frustrating to be the only polite person in your friend group, but it can move things so much to a good place if you start to compensate for the negativity that way. And I'd love to hear from you. I would love to hear about ways in which you've been able to move a negative communication climate into a positive communication climate. Or even if you haven't been the one that does it, how did you see it done, where a negative communication climate was moved into a positive communication climate, and what strategies were used? Because if we can hear from you about what's worked for you, maybe it can be better for all of us. So if you're one of my students, I want you to put that down in the discussion prompt that you see on our learning management system underneath this video. That's where I'd like you to answer it and just kind of talk about where you have improved your communication climate, how you improved your communication climate. I would love to hear about all that. For those of you who aren't my students, I'd still love to hear from you. I would love to hear how you've improved communication climates, what strategies were used, or if you've seen other people improve them, what strategies were used by those other people. I would love to hear that. So if you're just watching this on YouTube and you're not one of my students, I'd still like to hear from you. So just go ahead and type it in the comment section below on YouTube. Thank you so much.